Blog Talk Radio.
Let's talk Dugan. Let's talk Dugan. Let's talk Dugan. I suggest we talk openly and honestly. Let's listen to one another. Let's do as we say in the Middle East. Let's talk Dugan. That means straightforward. I'll tell you my needs and concerns. You'll tell me yours. And with God's help, we'll find the common ground of peace.
Live from New York, this is the BB Report Live Show on Israel.
So this is very important when we talk about Israel. But let's put this aside and welcome our guest joining us live from Israel in the early morning hours. There is Michael Lawrence. Michael was born in Wellington, New Zealand, far, far away. He's a leading consultant and charismatic speaker on Israel public diplomacy and current affairs. Michael is a qualified lawyer with a wealth of experience working with client organizations in Israel and across the globe. He's a former co-director of NU Campaign, an Israeli clothing brand that promotes Israel's contribution to global improvement and innovation. In addition to leading tours for diplomats, politicians, student leaders of political parties, and members of the foreign press, Michael has also appeared across media outlets that include Al Jazeera, BBC World Service, BBC Live 5, my childhood favorite show, Television New Zealand, Russian Today, National Radio, Israel National Radio, the Jerusalem Post, and the Jewish Times Asia. Together with his clients' groups, Michael explores a wide range of politically, religiously, and diplomatically sensitive issues that are central to understanding Israel, her neighbors, the Jewish world, and the search for peace and security in the Middle East. He's also on Twitter, Israel Speaker, where he shares his views on current affairs and the latest developments on Israel and the Middle East. So, Michael, good morning, and thank you for joining us here tonight.
Good morning. I hope everyone is doing well out there, and I'm pleased to be here to talk with you.
First, Michael, if you can share with the audience what are your professions and what is your primary focus on these days?
Well, the main work I'm involved in at the moment is exposing, first of all, foreign delegations to Israel. I'm exposing them to a different side of the Middle East picture that I don't think they're normally exposed to at all. Just as an example, I worked with a delegation of Australian journalists today, non-Jewish Australian journalists, and it was a challenging group. I took them out to Gush Etzion, which is of course a settlement block just south of Jerusalem, where at least 60,000 Jews are living. And it's a settlement block that, as they say, is within the Israeli consensus. It has a deep history, both biblically and then even in modern Israeli times, and will probably, we would say will stay, even if there is a peace agreement and a Palestinian state established, that this area would stay within what would be considered Israel. But here I am, and I'm working with these Australian journalists, and even the small concept, that there might just be a claim of Israel, the Jewish people, to this land, was a surprise to them. Over and over again, they're simply saying to me, but it's someone else's land. This is Palestinian land. And to try and get past that hurdle, even to discuss more deeper points, was very difficult. And that's what I face a lot of the time, that people come with their preconceptions. It's almost as if they're looking into the Middle East, but through a mirror, and in essence reflecting their own prior knowledge and values on the conflict. So that's the challenges I'm facing, and that's the work I'm doing the most of just at the moment.
When speaking for these groups and foreign media, what do you find, as you described, difficult the most to explain in defense of Israel? Is it just a lack of education of history and the facts, or the notion that keeps on coming up that Israel is not doing enough to advance peace or help with efforts to stabilize the Middle East region?
Yeah, I think that's something which is, we've been dealing this for now, I think almost for generations, the fact that Israel always has the responsibility for the stumbling of the peace process. It's always placed at its door. But I do see, when I speak to people, there's this sense that when I speak to them about the Palestinians leapfrogging the peace process, that they're trying to get to statehood, as we've seen in the last few weeks, without actually having to compromise, without actually having to sit down with Israel and say, okay, this is settled, we agree with this, we don't agree here, but let's talk about it. And then to get to a point where we say, well, we've signed the deal, that's the end of the conflict. I'm signing it off. There'll be no more claims. There'll be no more claims for refugees. There'll be no more claims on any more part of this land. And that's a difficulty, right? To try and explain that to people, the response I normally get is, well, look, the Palestinians have been doing this for 20 years, trying to make peace, and it hasn't got anywhere. So what do you expect them to do? And I think what we've got to continue to say is what we don't expect them to do is for them to have expectations that the world will gift them everything on a silver platter, and yet they won't need to give anything in the response. And what we're seeing now is the Palestinians trying to push Israel into the Palestinian positions even before negotiations begin. It's an interesting tactic. They know how to bring the media with them, the Western media, and a lot of Palestinian supporters. But that's something we've got to try and convince people is not the way to go. It's all about talking, it's about compromise, it's about negotiations.
We know that debating can be tough. I mean, some of our presidential contenders have proven that in the previous weeks. The question is, what is the right approach to take in, first and foremost, advocating on behalf of Israel, and secondly, in selling the Israeli brand for those who are not so intellectual or not so outspoken?
That's an interesting question, because I'm a strong believer that selling the Israeli brand is a completely different kettle of fish than defending Israel or promoting Israel on the political level. First of all, I think as a speaker, and I try to focus on this a lot, there are people who try to advocate for Israel who get very emotional. They like to scream and to yell and to get, to really bring their emotion forward about, I saw it especially during what they term the Intifada, the violence from the year 2000. I was living here then, and I listened to a lot of advocates, and they would say, "Oh, the blood of Jews is running through the streets of Jerusalem, and the bus bombs and the violence, and so on." And they would lose all focus through the emotion. And frankly, the way I look at things, and this is one of the keys, is to use emotion but not get emotional. Because when you get emotional, people automatically turn off. They're not interested in listening to a person. You're not serious if you're going on and on and on and screaming and yelling. You've got to use facts. You've got to be focused. You've got to come to a point. You've got to have a clear message. One other thing that I feel is very important, and I do this even when I take these delegations out to the towns in Yehuda v'Shamron and Judea, Samaria, in the West Bank, these Jewish towns, and I show them the security fence, and I talk about the international law. I don't deny that Muslims and Christians feel a connection to the land. Because when you deny other people's connections to the land, then these people will turn off, they'll close their eyes to you. So you've lost them, in essence. And this is a real problem. To appear human, because we are human. We're human people. We're Jewish people, or we're people who support Israel from other communities, which is great. But be human about it. It doesn't mean you need to give up on Jewish rights here or Israeli rights there, but express that you feel or you have some sort of understanding for the other side. That doesn't dictate your policy. It shows that you're a normal person, and that's extremely important as a foundation point, starting point for convincing them that Israel has any right to anything. And that's the way I approach things.
Let's turn to the hot topic everybody is talking and speculating about. Following media leaks on a possible Israeli strike on Iran, the IAEA report that some suggest is information that is 2 years old. First, what is ultimately Israel's response to that? And to follow up, do you believe that the Israeli government is trusted to deliver a promise given for years to actually prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear capabilities?
Certainly the media and the world was in such a frenzy in the last few weeks about this Iran attack. I almost had a feeling that the world would talk Iran and Israel into a war. There was that kind of feeling, that kind of buzz around it, not a very good buzz. But frankly, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm worried about Prime Minister Netanyahu and this particular government. I have a strong feeling, especially in comparison to past governments, that this government, more or less, I mean, politicians have a way of squealing out of a number of promises at times, but this government more or less has stayed along its own policy course and has stayed strong in that. There's been a great deal of pressure, as we know, from the Obama administration, from the EU, from things happening in the hallways of the UN, and this Netanyahu government appears to be on its course and is determined to stay that course. When Netanyahu says that Iran is a major risk to the existence of the Jewish people and to Israel, I think he means it. And I would be surprised, him particularly, and the people around him, his close advisors and the senior ministers, would allow Iran to reach the point where they would have an atomic weapon and so on. I may have not said the same thing about previous governments, which seemed at times almost fascinated about being respected and held in high esteem by other world governments and by the UN and so on. I don't recall the second part of your question. If you just remind me.
No, that was just ultimately my question about how do people trust the Israeli government in dealing with this. But I wanted to stay on this topic. Isn't the argument that Iran is already engaged effectively in war with Israel and the world by financing, supplying, and supporting its terrorist proxies in the region? I mean, just reading the intelligence reports on the arms hold of these terrorist groups could make anyone lose sleep at night, not only Minister Eli Yishai. Having said that, isn't Israel losing its deterrence and qualitative military advantage by just dragging time? And as Prime Minister Sharon said at the time, just let the missiles get rusty.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's funny how blind we can all be and how blind the world can be. Look, at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. In terms of existential threat to Israel, Iran is not quite there. But at the end of the day, they have operated and are operating against Israel at every turn, and you've hit it the nail right on the head. They're supporting, they're financing, they're instructing the Islamic Jihad terror group Hamas. Certainly, they've done so for Hezbollah for a number of years in Lebanon. So at the end of the day, they're a threat to Israel now. They're a threat to Europe. They're a threat to a lot of the world, and it's something Israel knows. I don't think Israel is trying to hide that fact, but the world look, we're facing a world that often has not accepted these kinds of arguments, and Israel's right to self-defense certainly do not accept Israel's right of generally to preemptive strikes and so on, even on ticking bomb terrorists in Gaza and so on. So it's something we all know, and it's something that's very difficult to live with. The fact that once again we are watching two of our borders being surrounded by terror groups building up their own missile stocks is not a comfortable feeling. And at some point, you know, when you put so much gunpowder in one place and have people walking around with matches around it, that's going to blow once again. And, you know, I think that Israeli intelligence, the IDF, is far better prepared, as we know, than it was in 2006 to deal with any threat. And IDF Chief of Staff Benny Gantz was talking yesterday that they have the tochniot in place, they have the programs in place, the strategy in place to enter and deal with Gaza should it be required. And so that's comforting in the least, although no one likes that kind of confrontational violence to have to take place.
The question is that while we're talking about strategy, and I don't know in which city you live in Israel, but in the meantime, another 2 rockets were launched yesterday at Israel, and we know that the government is responding to these attacks. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came out with very strong comments. He said that the other side will pay even more dearly for launching rockets at Israel until it stops firing. Now, the firing may have been reduced, but other than strategy, what do you think must be the next step and goal the government should be taking in dealing with this threat?
Well, I think if you, I don't recall which senior minister it was. It may have been Silvan Shalom, although I stand corrected if I'm wrong. He was saying just a few weeks ago that you know, this can't go on, and that Israel is creeping closer and closer to having to carry out a major operation in Gaza, and that there are certain policies that have worked in the past that Israel may be forced to return to, and I think we know what they are, in particular assassination of major terrorist leaders, which did have an effect. I mean, it sent the terror leadership both in the Palestinian Authority areas in the West Bank and also in Gaza underground for a number of years, and it's very hard to operate under those circumstances, and it helped to reduce terror. The problem is here is the same old problem, and that when there's not Jewish blood being spilt, when these rockets don't cause death, so we get the same old, well, these are just homemade projectiles that are being fired at you. You can't really respond to those, and the world condemns us. And again, while I think this Netanyahu government has more determination than that and can get past that hurdle, it still remains a hurdle. We do need to somehow maintain good relations, diplomatic relations with other countries, despite their skepticism about our right to self-defense. And there's a balance to strike. I would hope that the Netanyahu government's not just waiting to some major tragedy, but it is difficult. In the eyes of the world, they do not understand the trauma and the terror that children in particular, but everyone in the south of Israel faces as a result of what we're coming up to 10 years of rocket fire. It's no way to live. Certainly, it wouldn't take more than about 1 or 2 rockets to fall on Manhattan or Florida, Los Angeles or anywhere else, or London, Sydney, Australia, before those countries would respond in real force. But that right, that zchut, has not been given to Israel for some reason. And it's a challenge.
Meanwhile, we have seen Hamas come forth, at least, you know, if it's the Gilad Shalit deal, if it's now, you know, we have been reporting multiple times about that they are near of actually forging a unity government with Fatah. Do you look at that Hamas knows that Israel is looking out for them, and Israel is actually, you know, waiting for the right moment to strike them or take out the whole leadership or strike Iran, and therefore they're cozying in the Palestinian leadership's code in order to be protected? Or do you see it the other way, that the Palestinians, by taking this unilateral step at the UN and by rejecting time and again engaging with Israel in direct talks, taking a less moderate but more extreme step in uniting with Hamas, and we all know what the goal of Hamas is, the destruction of Israel?
Yeah, it's a funny one, because actually around the Gilad Shalit exchange time, there were specific commentators and newspapers and so on who were saying, well, we're actually seeing a change in Hamas. They're becoming more moderate, and watch out, they could really become a threat. And then one of the messages that they might have received from the Gilad Shalit exchange, and that Mahmoud Abbas of what is supposed to be more moderate Fatah group may have received this message that Israel or the world sees Hamas as possibly our alternative to Mahmoud Abbas, who's really stuck in his feet and said, I won't go any further with talks. I don't see it, frankly. I don't see yet that Hamas is at that point of fulfilling the Middle East Quartet's conditions, which is no violence, accepting past agreements with Israel, and accepting Israel's right to exist. I don't think Hamas is there yet. What's interesting about Mahmoud Abbas recently, and again, the problem with this is that the steps he's taken recently and the comments he's been making in the world media are somewhat extreme. And I'll list those in a second. And yet, the world does maybe some governments obviously see it, but you don't see the criticism of Mahmoud Abbas that I think we should be seeing. The man has taken positions recently that do not match a man who is supposed to be running after peace, who's supposed to be a partner for peace. And so now by colluding with Hamas, which I assume is an attempt here to show the world that they're worthy of statehood because the people are now united, there's none of this idea of having to be a three-state solution because of Hamastan and then Fatahstan and the West Bank. Now everybody's happy, everyone's getting along. I think that's a tactic. But then we look at what Mahmoud Abbas said recently about in the media, where he said openly, I will never accept a Jewish state. I will never acknowledge the Jewishness of a state, and so on and so forth, where he seems absolutely incapable of saying, my people, we will have to compromise. We will not be returning these millions of refugees, as they're called, to what will be an Israeli state. The most interesting report I've read recently, and I encourage you to look it up in Mr. and Mrs. Google, is an article in the Lebanese Daily Star, an interview with the Palestinian ambassador to Lebanon, where he said openly, and I honestly can't believe that this is in the public view and not hit upon by advocates for Israel, even by the Obama administration and so on. This ambassador to Lebanon from the Palestinians, he comes out and he says, even if we establish a Palestine, even if we establish a Palestinian state, the people, the refugees, and I put in brackets my own words, those people that they're continuously talking about that have no rights and Israel is punishing for this and for that and have no homes and so on, these people will not be given Palestinian citizenship. They will not be given Palestinian citizenship to that new state, which raises the question, what's going to be with those refugees? Where are they going? And the answer, I think, and it's all clear to us, and people who work in this field know it, that the Palestinians in the Arab world have this interest, continuous interest of generations already, to keep the pot boiling, to keep the refugees on the front of newspapers, to make it an issue almost for eternity. Because to say to those people, I'm sorry, you're not going back to Israel because Israel is going to be another country, well, that's in essence calling the conflict to an end in a major respect. What the Palestinians don't even realize, and what Mahmoud Abbas is not willing to say, is the two-state solution means Palestinians in Palestine and the Jewish people in Israel. And they're not willing to have this. So colluding with Hamas here, I don't see it as a great step forward. In fact, as I'm saying, as we're already seeing some sort of tightening or extreme policies by Mahmoud Abbas, he's now confirming where his real future lies, and it's not in negotiations. It might be in Palestinian unity, but it's not in making a peace agreement with Israel, at least in the short term, as far as I can see.
In the latest news out of Israel, it hasn't been reported here, and that's why I'm asking you to comment on that. Police have detained today 6 Palestinians dubbed West Bank Freedom Riders who boarded a Jerusalem-bound bus used by Jewish settlers, and they were claiming that it's discrimination, only taking Jews and not Arabs to these settlements. What can you share with us on that matter?
It's funny you ask, because I've actually been in how could I put it, heated confrontation with other people on Twitter. And
is Didi Remez one of them?
Pardon me?
Is Didi Remez one of them?
No, not Didi Remez, but someone else, the editor of a magazine. People can check my tweets in the last few hours at Israel Speaker. That's my name on Twitter. But it's so interesting, people jumping on this bandwagon of provocation. I cannot understand this concept of people complaining that there aren't Israeli bus services to Palestinian towns and picking up Palestinians. I mean, there are umpteen bus services servicing Palestinian towns, not necessarily by Israel, of course, because this is the Palestinian people who encourage and incite their youth in particular. They abuse their youth and encourage them, and they do, in fact, throw Molotov cocktails and rocks at these buses and have done for generations, and then in difficult times actually send their young people to go on these buses to blow them up. And now, I think, to be honest with you, I haven't read all the details, but I wouldn't be surprised if this is a group of Western activists, human rights activists as they call themselves, who are behind this. And in essence, what they've done is suggest to everyone that there's no Palestinian services, which is all nice and good, but at the end of the day, they are being serviced. They're being serviced by their own people. They can't, on one hand, say, we want Israeli buses to serve Palestinian towns, and on the other hand, say, we don't want Israeli, as they call occupation, we don't want the Israelis controlling our lives. Good for them. They have their own infrastructure. They have their own bus services. And one of the tweets I said today was that if you stand on Derech Hebron in Jerusalem, or any part of Jerusalem, you see Palestinian buses in the hundreds, which come in and out of Jerusalem from Bethlehem, from Beit Jala, out to Ramallah and so on, every single day. So I'm not sure what these people are going on about. There are services to Jerusalem. Because of security reasons, they have to be checked. But if I go into the West Bank, into the Jewish towns and come back into Jerusalem, I'm also checked. I mean, it's simply a provocation. It's a falsity. It's an absolute falsity, that whole saga.
Just politically, what do you make of the Sarkozy-Obama comments on Netanyahu as an Israeli? How offended were you by that?
Yeah, that was also the talk of the week. A bit of a bad gaffe there for particular President Obama, who seems to be under some threat of losing a segment of the Jewish vote in the coming elections. It's probably the last thing he needed. And I don't think these letters that they've written to Netanyahu, apologizing and so on, I'm not sure what good that does. What's interesting about it is that in another time, in another place, it could have done damage to the Israeli Prime Minister. I mean, Tzipi Livni, the opposition leader from the Kadima party, loves to jump on the bandwagon and say, Netanyahu has ostracized us in the international community. We're not respected in the community of nations because of Netanyahu. And this, you would think, would say, this would just put the nail on the head and say, yes, Netanyahu is a failure in foreign relations and so on. But what's interesting is that I didn't see that. I didn't see that effect. And the reason is because in Israel, and we've seen it in the polls continuously, there is a distrust rightly or wrongly, and I'm not interested too much in judging President Obama. That's not really my role. But there is a mistrust in the Israeli public for President Obama and his administration in terms of his friendship and support of Israel. And so, in fact, this hot mic mistake by Mr. Sarkozy and Mr. Obama, in fact, I would say strengthens Netanyahu further and just makes those leaders look a little bit politically and diplomatically immature or naive. And it's funny because the day before, I think it was the day before the microphone saga, Sarkozy had come out and said that he would certainly stand, and France would stand beside Israel if attacked by Iran, and so on. And then to call Netanyahu a liar the very next day, rather amusing.
And what's more interesting is that I attended the Jewish Federation's General Assembly, and Michael Oren and Dan Shapiro were sitting at a panel an hour before this report leaked, and they were just talking about how that the U.S.-Israel relationship is at its strongest point, and everybody was like, believing them. Going out of that panel, an hour later, the news leaked, and wherever I went, everybody was talking about this. In the breakout sessions the next day, everybody mentioned this fiasco. So it was interesting that on one side we say the relationship is so strong, on the other side we hear this. But I would like finally to just ask you, as an Israeli citizen living afar, how does this affect you that Israel is becoming a wedge issue in this presidential campaign, and how do you view the Republican contenders as bringing up some foreign policy alternatives? How does this play out for Israelis like you willing to see a change in course in the U.S. administration's policy towards Israel?
The Israeli public is always very interested in the lead up to American elections, and it does seem that the interest has it hasn't peaked yet, but the interest is climbing very, very fast here, even 12 months out from the election. It's interesting, the whole relationship between President Obama and Israel. I'm no expert on American politics, but I would say that there are a number of people in Israel and in the United States who have said that on certain levels the relationship between the United States and Israel has developed further under President Obama, especially apparently. I'm not privy to all the information, of course, but especially on the military plane, that things have strengthened, that President Obama has committed to Israel's qualitative edge, to its security in ways that possibly past administrations did not from their own fault, but things have developed and changed. I think the Arab Spring, which has now become a winter, the Arab winter in the region, and the instability maybe forces of President Obama's hand on that. So on certain levels, while there's been criticism of President Obama's tough line with Israel in terms of negotiating with the Palestinians and so on, and that I think that in some ways that's justified. President Obama has pushed Israel in certain directions that I think were not wise, and sort of weakened Israel's negotiating stance and maybe encouraged the Palestinians to push in directions they shouldn't be pushing in terms of gaining peace. But there's certain ways that the relationship is very, very strong and continues to develop, and certain, as we can see by the microphone gas and in the negotiations with the Palestinians, in parts that things could have been better. It's going to be interesting. I know that Mitt Romney and Herman Cain, Rick Perry and so on, the major Republican, Michelle Bachmann as well, they're focusing very much on the concept that President Obama has swept Israel under the carpet. They're going to continue to use that. It's a hot topic, as the Obama-Netanyahu relationship and so on. They're going to continue to ride on that and hope that will push them across the line, at least in terms of foreign policy. We'll have to wait and see if that's enough. I think the economy and the state of the American debt, unemployment, and so on may be really the key issue for Americans at this point in time.
Yeah, it's hard to predict in terms of politics. A year is like 3 decades, so it's hard to predict. Well, Michael, thank you so much for taking your precious time appearing on the show in the early morning hours. I wish you a good day, and for the audience, you could follow Michael on Twitter at Israel Speaker. His website is israelspeaker.com, and his Facebook group is also facebook.com Israel Speaker, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
So, Michael, thank you so much for coming onto the show, and I hope to host you in the near future.
Thank you.